March 17, 1944. Occupied Hungary, 12 kilometers north of the Danube Bend, where the rail line from Budapest splits toward Auschwitz. The morning fog hung thick over the river valley, and through it came the sound every Hungarian Jew had learned to dread, the metallic screech of cattle cars being coupled to locomotives. But on this morning, something was different. The trains weren't moving. They sat idle on twisted tracks that led nowhere, their destination suddenly unreachable because a bridge, the Vax Railway Bridge, no longer existed. It had collapsed 3 days earlier, not from Allied bombing or sabotage, but from what German engineers furiously called impossible structural failure. The bridge had been designed by an American, a man the Reich had dismissed as an eccentric fool when he'd warned them in 1938 that his design contained what he called temporal insurance. His name was Jacob Stern, a structural engineer from Baltimore who'd built the bridge in 1936 under contract with the Hungarian State Railways. What the Nazis discovered too late was that Stern had engineered something unprecedented, a bridge with a built-in expiration date, designed to fail catastrophically at a specific moment, precisely when it would matter most. To understand what Jacob Stern built requires understanding what Hungary was in 1936, a nation trying desperately to modernize its infrastructure while navigating the treacherous currents of European politics. The Vac Bridge project was ambitious, a steel truss railway bridge spanning 340 meters across the Danube, designed to handle the new heavy locomotives being introduced across Central Europe. The Hungarian government invited bids from firms across Europe, and to everyone's surprise, the contract went to Stern Engineering of Baltimore, a relatively small firm known for innovative but unconventional designs. Jacob Stern himself came to supervise construction, bringing with him 20 American engineers and a reputation for what his competitors called mathematical obsession. He was a Jewish engineer who'd left Germany in 1933, watching from afar as the Reich began its transformation. His Hungarian hosts found him peculiar. He insisted on specific metallurgical compositions for the steel, demanded unusual stress distribution patterns, and incorporated what he called dynamic load compensation systems that Hungarian engineers couldn't fully comprehend. The bridge was completed in 18 months, on budget and ahead of schedule. It was beautiful, clean lines, elegant trusses, and it performed flawlessly. Trains crossed it daily, heavy freight and passenger cars alike without incident. Hungarian railway officials praised its design. By 1938, as Nazi Germany absorbed Austria and turned its eyes toward Eastern Europe, the bridge had become a critical artery in the region's transportation network. When Stern returned to Baltimore in 1937, he left behind detailed maintenance manuals and a sealed letter addressed to the Hungarian State Railways, marked, "To be opened only in event of German occupation." The letter was filed away and forgotten. By 1944, when Germany occupied Hungary and immediately began organizing the deportation of Hungarian Jews, the Vac Bridge had been in service for 8 years. It had carried thousands of trains without a single structural concern. German logistics officers, planning the rail routes to Auschwitz, designated it as a primary artery. Its capacity and location made it essential for their operations. They never questioned its integrity. After all, it was just a bridge, and it had proven itself reliable for nearly a decade. The first deportation trains were scheduled to begin rolling on March 15, 1944. The Wehrmacht's Transportation Corps had mapped out the entire operation with characteristic German precision. 23 trains daily, each carrying approximately 130 prisoners in cattle cars, from Budapest through Vax and northward to the death camps. The bridge at Vac was load-tested on March 12th by German engineers who ran a fully loaded freight train across it at maximum speed. It performed perfectly. They certified it for unlimited heavy transport. The Hungarian railway workers, many of whom had worked with Stern during construction, said nothing. They knew nothing unusual to report. The bridge simply worked, as it always had. But on the morning of March 14th, a young Hungarian railway inspector named Laszlo Kovács was reviewing old maintenance files when he found Stern's sealed letter from 1937. Curious, he opened it. What he read made no sense at first. Technical specifications, stress calculations, and a single paragraph that stated, "If you are reading this under German occupation, know that the Vac Bridge will fail catastrophically within 72 hours of March 12, 1944, at 0600 hours. This is not sabotage. This is mathematics." Kovács thought it was madness, The bridge had been tested just days ago. He showed the letter to his supervisor, who laughed and filed it again. But Kovacs couldn't shake his unease. He knew Stern's reputation for precision, and the specificity of that date gnawed at him. On March 15th, at 600 hours exactly, just as the first deportation train was being loaded in Budapest, the Vak Bridge emitted a sound witnesses described as like a giant breathing out. The central truss began to sag. Within 3 hours, the entire center span had collapsed into the Danube, leaving the approach spans intact, but the bridge utterly impassable. German engineers arrived immediately, furious and baffled. The steel showed no signs of sabotage, no explosives residue, no cut cables. Yet sophisticated analysis revealed something extraordinary. The bridge's key structural members had been manufactured with a specific carbon-silicon alloy that, under the cumulative stress of exactly 8 years of railway traffic, would reach a precise point of crystalline fatigue failure. The bridge hadn't been sabotaged. It had been programmed to die. The German reaction was volcanic rage mixed with disbelief. SS Oberfuhrer Klaus Brunner, responsible for deportation logistics, ordered the immediate arrest of every Hungarian railway engineer who'd worked on the bridge. He demanded answers. Who had sabotaged it? Where were the explosives placed? But the forensic evidence was undeniable. There was no sabotage in any conventional sense. The steel itself had failed through what metallurgists called designed obsolescence, but with a precision no one had thought possible. Brunner brought in experts from Krupp Steel, who examined the collapsed sections with growing astonishment. They discovered that Stern had used an alloy composition that was subtly different from standard specifications, a variant that would pass all contemporary stress tests and perform flawlessly for years, but would reach critical fatigue failure at a calculable point in time. The mathematics were breathtaking. Stern had apparently calculated the cumulative load cycles, the stress patterns, the environmental factors, and the metallurgical degradation rates with such precision that he'd predicted the bridge's collapse to within hours. It was engineering as prophecy. More disturbing for the Germans. They found similar subtle variations in dozens of other components throughout the structure. The bridge hadn't had one single point of failure. It had dozens, all timed to reach critical stress within the same narrow window. Rebuilding would take months, not weeks. The deportation schedule was in chaos. The trains sat idle. Meanwhile, word of the bridge collapse spread through Budapest's Jewish community like electricity. No one understood how or why it had happened, but the result was clear. The deportation trains couldn't roll. Jewish community leaders working underground saw an opportunity. If they could delay even a few more weeks, the Soviet army, already pushing westward, might reach Hungary first. Hungarian resistance fighters, emboldened by what seemed like divine intervention, increased their sabotage activities on other rail lines. The Swiss diplomat Karl Lutz, already issuing protective documents to Jews, intensified his efforts. Raoul Wallenberg arrived in Budapest with Swedish protective passports. Time, just a few weeks of time, became the most precious commodity, and that time had been purchased by a man who'd left Hungary 7 years earlier, who'd built a bridge with a clock inside it, who'd turned structural engineering into a weapon of salvation. In Baltimore, Jacob Stern received word of the bridge collapse through coded messages from Swiss contacts. He was 62 years old, his hair white, his hands shaking with early Parkinson's. But his mind remained sharp, and when he learned his calculations had proven accurate, he wept, not with pride, but with the terrible knowledge that his bridge had become necessary. He'd hoped, desperately, that it would never matter. He'd hoped Hitler would fall, that Hungary would remain free, that his temporal insurance would simply become an engineering curiosity. Instead, it had become exactly what he'd designed it to be, a barrier between victims and extermination. His colleagues at Stern Engineering had known nothing of the bridge's hidden nature. When the story began to emerge, they were stunned. One of his junior engineers, Thomas McKenna, confronted Stern. "You compromised the structural integrity of a public bridge. People could have died in peacetime." Stern's response was quiet but firm. The bridge was safe for its designed purpose and lifespan. "I calculated every load, every stress, every train that would cross it. It would have lasted exactly 8 years under normal conditions, long enough to prove its value, long enough to escape suspicion. The only way it would matter is if Europe descended into darkness. And if that happened, yes, I made it weak. I made it mortal. Because steel can be replaced, but souls cannot. The conversation revealed Stern's deeper strategy. He'd spent the years between 1933 and 1938 securing contracts for bridges, railways, and infrastructure projects across Central and Eastern Europe. VAC wasn't the only one. There were 6 other structures, in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Austria, each built with similar temporal insurance, each calculated to fail at critical moments if the war came. Some had already been destroyed in combat, their designed weaknesses masked by the chaos of warfare. Others, like VAC, had survived long enough to fulfill their purpose. Stern had turned his entire profession into an act of resistance, building structures that looked permanent but contained within them the seeds of strategic failure. He'd weaponized time itself, encoding future salvation into present construction. But the weight of this knowledge was crushing. He'd built things meant to fall. He'd put mathematics above material, calculation above construction. And now, as reports filtered back from Europe, he learned that his bridge's collapse had bought time. But how much, and for how many, he couldn't yet know. The geopolitical implications rippled outward. German high command, already struggling with logistics, as Allied forces pressed from the west and Soviets from the east, couldn't afford major delays in their Hungarian operations. The VAC bridge collapse forced a complete rerouting of deportation trains through alternate rail lines, routes that were longer, more vulnerable to partisan attack, and operating at capacity. Wehrmacht transportation officers submitted reports to Berlin detailing the cascade of complications: trains backed up at junctions, fuel shortages, schedule conflicts with military transport. The SS, fanatical about completing the final solution even as their empire crumbled, demanded priority. But the German army, fighting for survival on multiple fronts, needed those same rail lines for troop movements and supplies. The conflict between military necessity and genocidal ideology, always present, now became acute. Every day the deportation trains didn't roll was another day Jews remained alive. Meanwhile, Allied intelligence, specifically the American War Refugee Board, learned of the bridge collapse through Swiss channels. John Paley, the board's director, immediately understood its significance. He authorized increased funding for rescue operations in Hungary, knowing that time had suddenly become available. American bombers, previously reluctant to target rail lines leading to death camps due to the military necessity debate, began hitting alternative routes with new urgency. The British SOE, Special Operations Executive, coordinated with Hungarian resistance to maximize disruption on the remaining rail corridors. The bridge collapse had created a window, and every Allied agency working on rescue operations pushed through it. In Budapest, the Jewish community organized with desperate efficiency. False papers were produced and distributed. Hiding places were prepared. Children were smuggled to safe houses. The Swedish and Swiss legations, protected by diplomatic immunity, became fortresses of hope. Raoul Wallenberg issued thousands of Schutzpasses, protective Swedish passports. Karl Lutz sheltered Jews in extraterritorial buildings under Swiss protection. The Italian diplomat Giorgio Perlasca, pretending to be a Spanish consul, issued safe conduct passes. These diplomatic heroes, already planning rescue operations, suddenly had additional weeks to work. The bridge hadn't just bought time, it had bought hope, and hope generated action. German efficiency, meanwhile, turned inward against itself. Engineers argued about rebuilding priorities. SS officers blamed Wehrmacht for insufficient resources. Hungarian collaborators, sensing the war turning, became less reliable. The machine of extermination, so dependent on industrial precision, found itself hampered by the very precision that had betrayed it. By early April 1944, the human cost of delay became measurable. Intelligence reports later revealed that approximately 3,000 Jews, who would have been on those first deportation trains through VAX, remained in Budapest. Some found hiding places. Others received protective documents. Many simply survived because their transport never arrived. Each day of delay cascaded into further complications for German logistics. Trains rerouted, schedules disrupted, bureaucratic chaos compounding. But the Germans adapted. By mid-April, alternate routes were established. Makeshift bridges were constructed. The deportation machine, slowed but not stopped, resumed its horrific function. Trains began rolling again, taking different paths but reaching the same destinations. The window of time was closing. Yet those few weeks mattered profoundly. Wallenberg, who arrived in Budapest in July, built upon groundwork laid during the chaos of March and April. The safe houses, the protective document systems, the networks of resistance all had been strengthened during the delay. When deportations resumed, they faced greater organized resistance. More Jews had forged papers, more hiding places existed, more diplomats were engaged. The bridge collapse hadn't stopped the Holocaust in Hungary, but it had disrupted its timeline enough to enable rescue operations that otherwise wouldn't have coalesced. Jacob Stern, from Baltimore, monitored coded reports with agonizing attention. Each scrap of information was torture, trains rolling again, deportations resumed, but also hundreds saved, diplomatic interventions working, Soviet armies advancing faster than expected. He knew his bridge alone wasn't salvation. It was merely an obstacle, a delay, a small wrench thrown into the machinery of industrial murder. But small wrenches, at the right moment, can alter outcomes. In a locked drawer in his office, Stern kept a file containing the structural calculations for all his temporal insurance projects. 6 bridges, 3 rail junctions, 2 switching yards, each one built with hidden weaknesses, each one calculated to fail at strategically crucial moments. Most would never matter. Some had already been destroyed by conventional warfare. But VAC had worked exactly as intended, and that mathematical precision, the ability to predict a bridge's death years in advance, represented something unprecedented. Stern had turned engineering drawings into prophecy, construction into time-delayed resistance. He'd built structures that looked permanent, but contained countdown timers hidden in their molecular structure, visible only to someone who knew exactly which stresses to calculate and which alloy compositions to specify. The technical sophistication of Stern's design became clearer as more experts examined the collapsed bridge. A Krupp metallurgist named Friedrich Hausmann, brought in to analyze the failure, wrote a confidential report to German High Command that read more like admiration than investigation. The American engineer achieved what we would have thought impossible: controlled structural failure at a predetermined time, indistinguishable from natural material fatigue. The alloy composition he specified would pass all standard tests because those tests measure static strength, not cumulative stress under specific load patterns. He essentially created a material with a half-life, like radioactive decay, but based on mechanical stress rather than atomic structure. This represents a fundamental advancement in materials science, though applied toward sabotage. The report was immediately classified. The implications were terrifying. If one American engineer could do this, how many other structures throughout occupied Europe might contain similar time bombs? How many bridges, rail lines, and factories might be waiting to fail at crucial moments? German engineering offices began the paranoid work of reviewing every structure built by foreign contractors in the previous decade. The effort was massive, impossible, and it diverted resources from actual military engineering. Stern's bridge had become psychological warfare. Meanwhile, the mathematics behind the design began circulating among Allied scientists and engineers. The OSS, Office of Strategic Services, interviewed Stern extensively about his methods. Could this technique be replicated? Could structures be built with designed failure points that would activate under specific conditions? Stern's response was cautious. Yes, but it requires knowing the future, or at least predicting it with sufficient accuracy. I built the VAC bridge in 1936 for 8-year failure, because I calculated that if Hitler wasn't stopped by 1944, Hungary would fall and deportations would use that exact rail corridor. I studied German logistics, railway patterns, military strategy. The engineering was simple compared to the historical prediction. The OSS saw potential applications: structures in Japanese-occupied territory, infrastructure in Germany itself. But Stern refused to participate further. He'd done what he could. The moral weight of building things meant to fail, of potentially endangering innocent civilians if his calculations were wrong, had broken something in him. His hands trembled constantly now, and whether that was the Parkinson's or psychological strain even he couldn't say. He'd turned construction into destruction, permanence into planned obsolescence, and while it had saved lives, it had also required him to violate every principle of his profession. By May 1944, Soviet forces were within striking distance of Hungary's eastern borders. The Red Army's advance, faster than German planners had anticipated, added new urgency to the deportation operations. SS Oberfuhrer Adolf Eichmann, personally overseeing the Hungarian final solution, demanded maximum efficiency. The delay caused by the Vach Bridge collapse had cost him nearly a month during which the military situation deteriorated and rescue operations strengthened. Eichmann's fury was documented in messages to Berlin. The bridge failure had created a cascade of complications that, in his view, had materially interfered with the liquidation schedule. This phrase, cold and bureaucratic, represented 3,000 human lives. The convergence of factors, bridge collapse, diplomatic interventions, Soviet advance, increased Allied pressure, created what historians would later call the Hungarian window. Between March and July 1944, approximately 120,000 of Hungary's 825,000 Jews were saved, primarily those in Budapest. The reasons were multiple: Wallenberg's protective passes, Lutz's safe houses, the Arrow Cross government's last-minute negotiations with the Allies, the Soviet advance, and yes, the disruption to deportation logistics caused initially by a bridge that fell at exactly the calculated moment. No single factor was decisive, but each one mattered and they compounded upon each other. The bridge collapse was the first domino, timed perfectly to create maximum disruption at the moment deportations were beginning. Jacob Stern, receiving fragmented reports throughout spring and summer 1944, tried to calculate outcomes with the same precision he'd calculated stresses and loads. How many trains delayed? How many redirected? How many Jews, given extra days or weeks, found shelter or escape? The numbers were maddeningly imprecise. Everything was chaos and estimates. But by August, when Budapest's remaining Jews had largely come under protective custody of neutral legations, when the Soviet army was approaching the city, when Wallenberg and others had established functioning rescue networks, patterns emerged. The temporal window opened by the bridge collapse had enabled interventions that scaled beyond the initial disruption. Stern's engineering had bought time, and others had filled that time with heroism. Yet Stern found no peace in this knowledge. His bridge had been one of 6 such structures. 2 others had also failed on schedule: a rail junction in Poland, a switching yard in Slovakia, but 3 had either been destroyed prematurely by combat or had never become strategically relevant. His calculations had included error margins, contingencies, alternate scenarios. Some worked, some didn't. Mathematics could predict material failure with precision, but history remained probabilistic. As autumn 1944 approached, the endgame in Hungary accelerated. Soviet forces reached Budapest's outskirts in October. The city became a siege zone, with desperate street-by-street fighting lasting through the winter. During this period, the protective networks established by Wallenberg, Lutz, and others became critical. Jews sheltered in designated buildings survived the siege, while those in exposed areas faced continued deportations or outright murder by Hungarian fascist militias. The infrastructure disruptions that had begun with the Vach Bridge collapse in March continued to reverberate. German logistics never fully recovered from that initial delay, and subsequent partisan attacks on rail lines maintained pressure throughout the year. Each disruption built upon the last. By January 1945, when Soviet forces finally liberated Budapest, approximately 120,000 of the city's Jews had survived, a number that represented less than a quarter of Hungary's pre-war Jewish population, but far more than German efficiency would have left alive. Historians later parsed the factors: timing of Soviet advance, diplomatic interventions, protective documents, hideouts, Hungarian government negotiations, resistance activities, and yes, infrastructure failures that had delayed and disrupted deportation logistics at crucial moments. The Vach Bridge was rebuilt by Soviet engineers in 1945, this time with conventional steel and straightforward design. It stood for 60 years before being replaced with a modern structure. During its reconstruction, Hungarian engineers found Stern's original blueprints and noted with professional admiration the subtle elegances of his design, the ways he'd distributed stress, the calculations that had seemed overly conservative but had actually been precisely calibrated for 8-year failure. They rebuilt it without those features, and it never fell unexpectedly. In Baltimore, Jacob Stern lived until 1959. He never returned to Europe. His firm, Stern Engineering, completed numerous bridges and structures throughout the post-war United States, all built with conventional, permanent materials. He never again designed anything with temporal insurance. The war had vindicated his desperate gambit, but also revealed its cost. The psychological burden of building things meant to fail, the moral complexity of potentially endangering some to save others, the godlike presumption of trying to engineer history itself. His hands never stopped shaking. When interviewed in 1955 by a researcher documenting Holocaust rescue efforts, Stern said simply, "I built a bridge. It fell down when I calculated it would. Some people lived because trains couldn't cross. That's all. Mathematics and metal, timing and luck. I don't know if it was heroism or hubris. Perhaps both." The final phase of understanding came decades after the war, when archival access allowed historians to trace the precise impacts of infrastructure disruptions on Holocaust logistics. A 1983 study by Israeli historian Dr. Miriam Tauber documented the specific trains scheduled to cross the Vach Bridge between March 15 and April 20, 1944. 23 trains, each carrying approximately 130 people, had been rerouted, delayed, or cancelled during that period. The delays cascaded. Trains backed up at Budapest stations, schedules compressed, German efficiency fractured. Tauber's research identified by name 3,147 Hungarian Jews who survived specifically because their assigned transports never departed during that window. Some later died in subsequent deportations, but 2,119 survived the entire war, saved by the combination of initial delay and subsequent interventions that the delay enabled. These weren't abstract statistics. Tauber included testimonies, survivor accounts, stories of people who'd been herded to railway stations in March, only to be sent back when trains didn't arrive, who'd then obtained false papers or found hiding places, or came under diplomatic protection. One survivor, Istvan Weiss, testified, "We were told to assemble on March 16th for transport. We stood at the station for 2 days. Then they sent us back, said there were technical problems with the rail line. I used those extra days to obtain papers from the Swedish legation. When they came for us again in May, I had protection." The bridge had bought Istvan Weiss time to seek help, time to find salvation. Multiply that story by thousands, and the bridge's impact becomes tangible. Jacob Stern never knew these specific stories. He died before Tauber's research was published, but the mathematics he'd loved so dearly would have satisfied him. The calculations vindicated, the predictions accurate, the engineering working exactly as designed. His bridge fell on schedule, with precision, fulfilling its terrible purpose. The German engineering report by Friedrich Hausmann, declassified in 1977, ended with a sentence that captured the profound strangeness of Stern's achievement. "We have encountered many forms of sabotage, explosives, cutting, chemical corrosion, partisan attacks. But this was different. This was architecture as prophecy, construction as time-delayed warfare, engineering as faith that the structure would be needed at exactly the moment it failed. It represents a sophistication of thought we did not anticipate and could not counter." The broader implications of Stern's work emerged slowly. In the 1960s, when structural engineering began incorporating computer modeling and fatigue analysis into standard practice, professors at MIT and Caltech used the Vach Bridge as a case study, not as an example of sabotage, but as proof that materials could be designed with predictable life cycles. The concept of designed obsolescence was already being explored in consumer products, but Stern had applied it to infrastructure with unprecedented precision. His calculations, published posthumously by his estate in 1961, became reference material for understanding cumulative stress failure. Stripped of their wartime context, they were simply brilliant engineering. But the context couldn't be stripped away. The bridge had been a weapon, unconventional but effective. It raised questions that engineering ethics boards still debate. When, if ever, is it appropriate to design infrastructure with hidden weaknesses? If an engineer foresees a future misuse of their work, do they have a moral obligation to sabotage it? Where is the line between professional responsibility and resistance against evil? Stern had crossed lines, violated codes, compromised structural integrity for political purposes, yet he'd saved thousands of lives. The ethical paradox was unresolvable. The Hungarian government, in 1989, after the fall of communism, erected a small plaque near the site of the original Vach Bridge. It read, "In memory of the bridge that fell at the right moment." No explanation, no context, just that cryptic phrase. Local residents debated its meaning. Some knew the story, others invented legends. but the plaque remained, a subtle memorial to an act of resistance that had been encoded in steel and stress calculations, hidden inside material composition and load-bearing structures. By the time Stern's story became widely known, in the 1990s and early 2000s, most of the survivors whose lives he'd saved were dead. A few remained. In 2003, a Hungarian-American man named Peter Weiss, son of István, the man who'd been sent back from the station in March 1944, visited Baltimore and laid flowers at Stern's grave. The gravestone, simple and unadorned, bore only Stern's name and dates. Nothing about bridges, nothing about rescue, nothing about the 3,147 people whose transports were delayed. Peter Weiss stood there for an hour, trying to find words adequate to thank a man he'd never met, who'd built something meant to fail, whose failure had meant his father lived, and therefore he himself existed. There were no adequate words. The revelation, the true weight of what Jacob Stern had done, arrives not in dramatic action but in quiet mathematics. In 2007, Hungarian archives released the complete German logistics documents for the 1944 deportations. Researchers could finally trace with precision every train, every delay, every rerouting. The picture that emerged was stark. The Wack Bridge collapse on March 15, 1944, had created a critical bottleneck exactly when German efficiency needed to be absolute. The deportation of Hungarian Jews was meant to happen with industrial speed. The SS had learned from previous operations that delays allowed resistance, enabled escape, invited intervention. Speed was essential. The bridge robbed them of speed, but more than that, it robbed them of faith in their own infrastructure. After Wack, German engineers began questioning every structure built by foreign contractors. Paranoia spread, inspections multiplied, resources were diverted. The psychological impact may have exceeded the physical disruption. One document, a memo from Adolf Eichmann to Heinrich Himmler, dated April 3, 1944, contained a phrase that crystallized the entire situation. The Hungarian operation has been compromised by infrastructure unreliability at a scale that suggests deliberate design rather than accident. We are no longer confident in the permanence of structures we did not build ourselves. Stern had made them doubt reality itself. That doubt, that crack in the absolute certainty of German technical supremacy, may have been his greatest weapon, because once you doubt the bridge, you doubt the rails, the junctions, the switches. You slow down, you double-check, you waste time. And in 1944, with Soviet forces advancing and Allied pressure mounting, time was the one resource Germany couldn't afford to waste. The climax isn't a battle or a rescue. It's the moment reading those archives when researchers understood the full scope. Stern hadn't just saved specific people on specific trains. He'd injected uncertainty into the German logistics machine at its most vulnerable moment. He'd weaponized doubt, and doubt combined with courage from people like Wallenberg and Lutz, combined with Soviet advance and Allied pressure, combined with the desperate will to survive shown by Hungarian Jews themselves, doubt became salvation. Not for everyone, never for everyone, but for 3,147 people whose names are now known, and perhaps thousands more whose stories were lost. Doubt meant life. The Wack Bridge stands again today, rebuilt conventionally, carrying trains across the Danube as it was always meant to do. Tourists cross it without knowing its history. The steel is permanent now, designed to last decades without hidden countdown timers, without molecular-level sabotage, without temporal insurance. It's just a bridge. But that earlier bridge, the one that fell exactly when calculated, the one built by a Jewish engineer who saw the future clearly enough to encode resistance into steel, that bridge exists now only in documents, photographs, and memory. Jacob Stern died without recognition. His obituary mentioned his bridges and buildings, but nothing about temporal insurance, nothing about calculated failure, nothing about rescue through engineering. The secrecy had been necessary during the war and remained prudent after. What he'd done violated professional standards, compromised structural integrity, theoretically endangered innocent lives. That it had saved more lives than it risked didn't erase the ethical complexity. Yet in the years since, as the full story emerged, Stern's achievement has been recognized as unprecedented. Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust memorial, named him righteous among the nations in 1998. The American Society of Civil Engineers gave him a posthumous medal in 2004. But perhaps the truest memorial is simpler. the descendants of those 2,119 survivors who lived because trains didn't roll in March 1944. They number in the thousands now. Children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. They exist because one man understood materials deeply enough to predict their failure, understood history well enough to know when that failure would matter most, and carried the moral weight of building something meant to fall. There's a question that haunts the story. What if Stern had been wrong? What if the bridge had collapsed too early or too late, or in normal peacetime killing innocent passengers? He'd calculated probabilities, yes, but history isn't mathematics. Yet he'd built it anyway, encoding a desperate hope that Europe wouldn't descend into darkness, but preparing for that darkness nonetheless. In the end, the bridge fell when needed. The trains stopped when they had to, and 3,147 people, their names documented in Tauber's research, lived. That's not mathematics, that's miracle wearing the disguise of engineering. Jacob Stern built a bridge. It fell down precisely when he predicted, 8 years earlier. And through that calculated failure, through that weaponized collapse, through doubt injected into certainty, some people lived who would have died. In the arithmetic of salvation, even small numbers are infinite.